Hi ladies and gents, tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams, to a place where sandals slap stone floors, candles flicker low, and the only real drama is whether Brother Oswin remembered to feed the scriptorium cat. It begins, as most things do, in utter mundanity. A grainy little sparkle, not much larger than a snowflake. Salt, not the exciting pink Himalayan on a charcuterie board kind. No, this is your classic, crusty, noble Roman flake. The kind that stuck in the beard of empire builders and paid the wages of soldiers who probably hadn't bathed since the last eclipse. Salt, unlike love or politics, does one thing and does it well. It preserves fish, meat, power structures. Entire empires have been held together longer than leftover lasagna because someone figured out how to store anchovies properly. Now, get comfy because we're gliding further back than Julius Caesar's hairline. Back before forks, before France was France. Picture this: Neolithic humans, fuzzy, unshaven, and still slightly suspicious of fire. Crouched beside salty marshes, poking the ground with sticks and thinking something like, this dirt tastes oddly delicious. Because that, my sleepy friend, is how one discovers salt, and how evolutionary destiny favors the curious over the flavorless. In ancient times, salt was more than a condiment. It was currency, miracle, and minor diva. So vital was sodium chloride that the word salary comes from salarium, which was literally salt money. A Roman allowance given to soldiers so they wouldn't leave the army to go buy bacon, which, ironically, they didn't even have yet. The Romans used salt not just on the latrine-shy fish they packed for long campaigns, but also in rituals, treaties, and possibly even to flavor their feelings. A Roman general, standing across a blood-soaked field, might have muttered, "Ah yes, victory. Could use some time and a pinch of salt." But let's go even snugglier. Drift with me to ancient China, around 2700 BCE, before pants were standardized, when emperors dined in silence and people considered fermented boar ankle a treat. There, amid misty bamboo forests with names like Cloud Elbow Grove and the hill of inadvisably wide yaks, clever folks were boiling brine in ceramic jars to harvest salt. It sizzled and steamed, a tiny revolution in a pot. Paper would come later, noodles too, but boiled salt water, that was national infrastructure. Have you ever heard of the Salt Commission of the Tang Dynasty? Of course you haven't, because it sounds like something invented to make 9th grade history exams unbearable. But sit with this. In Imperial China, salt taxes funded vast segments of the government. Peasant rice was taxed, yes, but only salt could turn a drizzle of state control into a flood. Spices were for nobles. Salt was for everyone, which in a way made it dangerously democratic. Over Shinanshashwiji, Egypt, where the sun pressed against stone like an overbearing aunt, salt became something sacred. Mummies, those ancient celebrities, were packed with natron, a salt compound so desiccating it made jerky jealous. To preserve the soul, you first had to preserve the spleen. And while pharaohs fretted about pyramids and afterlives, it was the salt merchants quietly becoming pharaoh-rich. But perhaps the most beautifully domestic whisper in this grainy tale comes from an Assyrian tablet dated to around 2700 BCE. It contains a recipe, carefully etched in cuneiform, for salt-cured goat cheese. Not a poem, not a treaty, a recipe. Humanity, even 5 millennia ago, was already writing down how to make food more delicious, which proves that long before poetry, humans were romantically invested in lunch. So as you listen, nestled in your nighttime nest, remember, Each crystal of salt sits at the delicate crossroads between survival and flavor, between a fish kept fresh and an empire financially lubricated. It is a substance so humble, so dusty white, you'd never know it once dictated the trajectory of entire civilizations. But we're just getting started. For now, let your thoughts wander like a monk, with nothing urgent on his scroll. In his hand is a pinch of salt. Behind him, Brother Oswin gently snores, and the scriptorium cat stretches, quite unfed, but forgiven. Press that like button before your eyelids press themselves, and sleep, dear listener, knowing the most ordinary things hold the most extraordinary secrets. Long before salt was rattled out of little shakers onto French fries or sprinkled over caramel, like some hipster alchemist's idea of dessert, it was already quietly changing the human story. Picture this. The year is somewhere around 6000 BCE. Woolly mammoths are passé. Agriculture is the new trend. And some very tired Neolithic farmer is licking a rock and thinking, that's oddly delicious. Salt, simple, crystalline, unexpectedly powerful, was not merely a seasoning. It was an economic force, a preservative miracle, and in many ways, the original influencer. But instead of selfies and hashtags, its endorsers were empires, and its effects went viral in the form of trade routes, revolutions, and the occasional battle. Let us land our imaginary time-traveling balloon in the Mesopotamian river valleys. Those watery cradles of civilization were not just fertile. It turns out they were also a bit salty. Literally. The Sumerians, brilliant inventors of cuneiform writing and intercity passive aggression, had already begun to understand the curious properties of salt. Not only did it bring out the flavor in their lentil stews, it was also the key to preserving fish hauled from the distant Persian Gulf. Salt meant food could last longer, long enough to travel, long enough to feed a city, or perhaps even long enough to be sold for something shinier. This was humanity's first real flirtation with culinary sustainability. And like many early relationships, it was deeply entwined with the messy business of power dynamics. Over in ancient Egypt, land of pyramids, papyrus, and some fairly extravagant eyeliner, salt was quietly at the center of things. The Egyptians used it to preserve not just their fish, but their pharaohs. Yes, embalming involved natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture that kept important people looking. Surprisingly presentable for the afterlife. In essence, salt was the line between decay and divinity. Without it, ancient Egyptian funerals would have been far more awkward affairs. Even the Hebrew Bible throws in its salty 2 shekels. Salt is referenced as a symbol of purity, loyalty, and permanence. There's even a salt covenant in there, which sounds like a dramatic cooking show and definitely isn't. In fact, it was a mark of unbreakable agreement, far more binding apparently than a pinky swear. Now let's drift northward, like a cloud of ceremonial incense, up toward the alabaster temples of ancient Greece. The Greeks took salt seriously, so much so that they wrapped it into their word for divine hospitality. When guests came for dinner, salt was often presented to welcome them. Refusing to share your salt would be like refusing to greet someone with "hello today," and then immediately unfollowing them on all socials. Hostile, uncalled for, and absolutely noted. But it was the Romans who truly codified salt's celebrity status. Behind their marble columns and efficiently straight roads, the Romans were absolute salt enthusiasts. In fact, one of their chief military supply lines was called the Via Salaria, the Salt Road. Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt, or rather given allowances to buy it. This is where we get the word salary. Yes, the next time you sigh over your paycheck, remember, you could be handed a small pile of salt instead. Though imagine how well that would flavor your takeout. Salt didn't just help preserve food and mummies, it preserved power. Empires leveraged it, taxed it, hoarded it. It was stable, tradable, and desirable, which is more than can be said for quite a lot of emperors. It's astonishing how many borders, bridges, and bribes were built on a substance that now comes in tiny paper packets with cheerful logos. Back in China, around 2000 BCE, salt was being harvested from the surface of salt lakes, boiled out from briny waters, and eventually tapped from underground wells using techniques that would later inspire early drilling technology. Yes, the same minds who brought us paper and fireworks were also perfecting salt engineering with bamboo and bronze tools. The salt tax, an invention that governments everywhere probably discuss with misty eyes, was first recorded here. It would go on to provide emperors with a steady river of revenue and give peasants just one more reason to grumble. As salt's reputation spread across continents via trade caravans, sea routes, and camel-powered commerce, it slowly began to etch unseen paths across the map, defining what cities would rise, which ports would thrive, and what lands might one day fall to the sword or the spoon. Centuries before television, chefs added, just a pinch, salt was defining borders, economies, even identities. It turns out that bland might be beautiful, understated, patient, and quietly taking over everything. Let's allow the dust of these ancient roads to settle for a moment. Soon, we'll follow salt's glittering trail westward, toward kings, crusades, and culinary chaos. But for now, rest your eyes and imagine the soft sparkle of ancient salt crystals resting beneath a golden desert sun. Ah, ancient China. A vast land of emperors, dragons, and scrolls so long you could use one as a scarf. It was here, over 2,000 years ago, that salt quietly began moonlighting as a secret agent of empire. The Han Dynasty, clever souls that they were, didn't just season their dumplings with salt, they seasoned their entire state revenue with it. Now you may be wondering, why salt? Why not jade, or silk, or something more obviously shiny? But here's the sleepy twist. Salt wasn't glamorous, and that's exactly what made it powerful. Like a humble background actor turning out to be the real hero of the film, salt just supported everything. No trade route, no army, and certainly no bowl of pickled cabbage went anywhere without a good dose of mineral magic. China, being early to the party of organized bureaucracy, figured out the math rather quickly. People needed salt, daily. For taste, sure, but more importantly, for survival. The human body, after all, isn't so different from a soup, unbalanced without salt. Stir too much, and things get dizzy. Valleys like the Sichuan and regions around Shaanxi were positively brimming with briny potentials. In fact, those clever ancient engineers of the Eastern Han period were drilling wells thousands of feet deep, using nothing but bamboo, rope, and boundless optimism. It was impressive, and also mildly terrifying considering bamboo is more commonly associated with pandas and umbrella handles. These bamboo derricks looked a bit like upright accordion skeletons stacked by a cubist. But functionality matters more than fashion, and function they did. Once salt brine was located, it was hoisted up and evaporated in large iron pans. That's right, we're talking about industrial salt works 2,000 years before industrial revolutions were cool. This was no hobby operation. The government took one whiff of the salty steam and said, "Yes, please, we'll take that." And so began the imperial monopoly on salt. It was simple statecraft. Whoever controlled the salt controlled the taste and the taxes. There was even a posh-sounding official title for the salt administrators, the Salt and Iron Commission. Now, doesn't that sound like the name of a progressive metal band? But these commissioners weren't rocking guitars. They were rocking spreadsheets, papyrus style. Salt revenues churned in massive amounts of coin, or cash strings, to be precise. Ancient Chinese money was often made with holes in the middle, so it could be looped together. Practical, yes. Mildly fashionable, possibly. Jingly, absolutely. Families far and wide paid a salt tax, whether they were pickling turnips or cooking rice. It was baked, sometimes literally, into daily life. And what's remarkable, almost meditative, is how seamlessly this grainy necessity became a thread in the vast tapestry of dynastic power. There's something oddly poetic about it, really. Wars may have been won with swords and arrows, but empires were funded by dinners and dumplings. And while a general might inspire loyalty, a government that controls the recipe for pickled plum sauce commands far deeper compliance. Of course, there was resistance. Human nature never sits still for long, much like an oiled pig. Certain merchants tried their luck outside the imperial circuit, building underground pipelines of illicit brine. Salt smugglers. Yes, that was a very real profession. Picture shadowy figures slipping across mountain paths, dusty bags clinking softly with crystallized contraband. Dangerous work, and oddly reminiscent of a fantasy novel subplot, titled something like The Brine Cartel's Secret. But the truth is, most people didn't have the time or appetite for rebellion. They had rice to cook, vegetables to save, and kidneys that preferred not to cramp up. So they paid the tax. Governments grew fat on salt-fed funding. Armies marched with seasoned rations, and the slow, steady beat of civilization kept time with the evaporation of brine in iron pans under an ancient sun. In one sense, that old Chinese monopoly was less an exercise in greed and more a symphony in balance. Bureaucracy meets biology. A pinch of salt from the right hands could quiet a revolt before it boiled. It was power in crystalline form. And there, as clouds of steam drifted up from bamboo-piped wells and coins strung like wind chimes clinked softly on tax counters, the story of salt was growing ever more granular. Next, we'll drift westward, carried on the dry whispers of desert winds, to a land where caravans shimmered like mirages, and salt didn't just season food, it paid for camels. As twilight painted the ancient world in soft blue shadows, a curious tale of salt and empire unfolded beneath the sandals of weary Roman merchants. You see, salt wasn't just a seasoning for bread or a flavor enhancer for lentils. It was Rome's quiet obsession. It glittered not only on their tables, but in their economy, in their language, and in the very arteries of their empire. Let's take a calming meander down one of history's lesser-traveled highways, the Via Salaria. Literally, the Salt Road. This ancient route wasn't named. Ironically, like calling a giant tiny or a loudmouth Tacitus, it really was the road that delivered salt to early Roman settlements. In a time when logistics involved donkeys and backache, the Via Salaria was the salty superhighway connecting the Adriatic coast to the cradle of Rome. Imagine Roman traders trudging past pine forests and over sleepy hills, carrying crude sacks of salt, each crystal a miniature fortune. Salt was used to preserve meat, pay soldiers, and actually lent its name to a thing we all still care deeply about, salary. Yes, the Roman word salarium referred initially to the allowance paid to soldiers for the purchase of salt. Essentially, here's your paycheck, don't eat it all at once. While historians quarrel, as only historians can, about the precise nature of this exchange, the fact remains: salt was currency, and like all proper currencies, it had the power to build and bind civilizations. Not bad for a white rock that melts in water. The Roman obsession with salt didn't stop with the legions. No, it wormed its way into their vocabulary like a tadpole into a toga. A man of wit was said to possess sal, meaning salt, because humor was considered piquant, tasty, salted, rather than bland. A clever dinner guest, therefore, was seen as flavorful, which, to be fair, is better than being called chewy. Salt even played a humble but vital role in religious rituals. It was sprinkled on sacrificial animals, tucked into offerings, and in one particularly vivid instance, rubbed into the walls of new homes to keep away evil spirits, sort of like seasoning your real estate against the maliciously paranormal. As Rome grew from a republic to an empire, the administration of salt became a serious business. Salt pans, those shimmering sun-baked flats near the coastline, were watched over by officials who, we presume, managed to turn even salt into bureaucracy. There were taxes on salt, permits for its sale, and surely a very stern man named Marcus, who insisted on weighing it twice. But here's where things get quietly dramatic and still very sleepy, because salt, being valuable, also became political. An emperor who controlled salt controlled morale, rations, and trade. When supply chains were disrupted by snow in mountain passes, pirates along the Mediterranean, or general Roman enthusiasm for conquest, the price of salt could wobble just like a senator on his 6th goblet of wine. Even revolts occasionally simmered over salt shortages. Not full-scale revolutions necessarily, but enough grumbling from the masses that emperors took note. You could stab Caesar on the Ides of March, but heaven help you if you cut off salt to the bakery district. And then there was Ammianus Marcellinus, a slightly grumpy 4th century historian with a flair for the dramatic. He wrote that Roman soldiers once rioted when their salt rations were late. Not their pay, not their armor, just their daily sprinkle of morale. Picture that. Otherwise stoic men in bronze, getting fussy over their lunch seasonings. It's tragic, it's endearing, it's deeply Roman. So next time you toss a little salt over your left shoulder, or find yourself reaching for it at dinner, remember those ancient roads and salt pans, the mule caravans and overworked administrators, the witty guests and lightly salted revolts. All this from a tiny mineral that somehow held together an empire. And as the salty dust settles on the cobblestones of ancient roads, let's turn our gaze a little farther east, where brine and barter once shaped the fortunes of empires far beyond the Mediterranean's reach. As it turns out, salt not only seasoned soup pots across the centuries, it also had a sneaky way of stirring the geopolitical stew. And nowhere was this more fragrant than in ancient China, where salt didn't just make congee taste better. No, it helped build an entire bureaucracy, and possibly gave a few emperors a salt-induced superiority complex. We drift now to the banks of the Yellow River, around 2,500 years ago. The people of China were not just boiling rice and writing poetry, though they did quite a bit of both. They were already masters of salt production, gently coaxing salt from saline wells, steaming it patiently like a meditative tea ceremony with economic implications. While the West was still licking Mediterranean rocks and hoping for the best, the Chinese had salt ponds, evaporation fields, and state-operated enterprises, long before that was a buzzword on corporate flowcharts. You see, in China, salt wasn't just a condiment. It was a revenue stream the size of the Yangtze. Dynasties understood this early on, Where there's salt, there's power. And where there's power, there are bureaucrats. The first truly salty governance emerged during the Han Dynasty, around 120 BCE, when the state decided it would be best if private merchants kindly stopped profiting from the nation's sodium. The emperor at the time, Emperor Wu, whose hobbies included expanding territory and centralizing power, declared that salt should be a government affair. Overnight, salt became a state monopoly. Imagine waking up and discovering your local sea salt shop is now being run by the Ministry of Saline Delights. An esteemed official, Sang Hongyang, a name that probably doesn't come up much at dinner parties, was appointed to manage revenue from salt and iron. Sang was a prodigious mind, and his economic plans were dazzling, or at least mildly satisfying from a spreadsheet perspective. The salt tax collected under Sang's policy funded not only the empire's many, many wars, but also the ever-expanding imperial bureaucracy. Inadvertently, salt revenue helped build some fairly ornate palaces, paved several hundred imperial roads, and ensured that the handlebar-mustached ministers of the Han court had plenty of scrolls on hand, and possibly snacks. Now, just to paint the picture more softly, imagine tiny clay cauldrons simmering in hut kitchens, while somewhere off in the capital, imperial clerks in long flowing robes carefully catalogued how many granules of salt had flowed into government hands that week. In some strange way, salt connected the peasant with the palace, a pinch of preservation for the farmer, a bucket of bureaucracy for the empire. Centuries later, the Song dynasty raised the bar even higher, perhaps saltier. They introduced salt certificates, essentially an early form of state-issued paper currency. Because why should coins have all the fun? These certificates allowed merchants to transport and sell salt in designated areas, bringing a sense of controlled capitalism to the sodium sphere. This system was so meticulously, gloriously specific, it permitted the Song dynasty to fund their military, infrastructure, and, most critically, poets. Everyone knows you can't write wistful laments about moonlight without the proper financial backing. And naturally, with any highly taxed good comes a robust shadow industry. Salt smuggling was a real career path in dynastic China. Bandits and enterprising entrepreneurs quietly moved illegal salt along rivers, trails, and boat under the cover of darkness routes. Some towns thrived on black market brine. Some local legends claim that salt smugglers were garlanded as folk heroes, slipping past tax officials with the stealth of a cat and the seasoning of a chef. It's oddly soothing to imagine a salt smuggler bedding down in a bamboo thicket, spooning a small burlap sack of the finest contraband Qinghai crystals, while somewhere far away, yet another official sharpened his brush to log yet another shipment lost en route. All of this, laws, poetry, rebellion, paperwork, because of something that, when scattered on the table, barely makes a sound. Salt-shaped China, not through noise or conquest, but through the quiet comfort of bureaucracy, the rituals of taxation, and the perfectly preserved pickled cabbage. And while the East was mastering the politics of preservation, far to the west, those pesky Romans were beginning to see the sparkle of salt in their sandals. But that, of course, is another softly seasoned secret waiting to be unwrapped. By the time salt had infiltrated the steaming kitchens of ancient Greece, it was no longer just a humble crystal for keeping things from rotting. It had found philosophical depth, and if you've ever held an olive in one hand and a feta-slathered fig in the other, you might suspect the Greeks were onto something salty and sacred. The curtain of myth had drawn back slightly, just enough for salt to step onto the stage of civilization with an air of quiet sophistication. This, after all, was a civilization that could hold a symposium, a fancy word for boozy academic dinner party, and debate whether salt was the soul of the sea or simply Poseidon's confetti. The Greeks, gods bless them, used salt for two things at once: to make food edible and to make thoughts profound. You might find Heraclitus chewing salted fish and muttering about rivers you couldn't step into twice, or Plato discussing the moral dilemma of anchovy brine. Salt was both snack and symbol, a tangible philosophy you could sprinkle on your barley porridge. In Homer's Iliad, warriors dine with divine salt, considering that the same warriors were also trying to kill one another with bronze swords. It's nice to know they had time to honor seasoning. Even the gods, excessively immortal as they were, demanded sacrifice, salted meats no less. Because if you're going to hand a hunk of beef to Zeus in the thunderous sky, you'd better make sure it's properly cured. Divine beings may be powerful, but they are not immune to blandness. But it wasn't just Olympus that had developed a taste for salt. In the bustling agora of Athens, amid merchants haggling, philosophers prophesying, and someone definitely losing a sandal, salt was traded like whispered poetry. It preserved fish hauled in from the Piraeus docks and gave life to preserved olives, occasionally mistaken for projectiles in especially heated political debates. Salt, for the Greeks, became less of a commodity and more of a cornerstone. It was so essential the word halas, Greek for salt, was related to haulos, meaning sea. In a small twist worthy of a sun-drenched tragedy, the same sea that birthed their salted anchovies also brought both trade and terrifying naval warfare. Battles may have raged on the waves, but behind the triremes and the spears stood barrels of salted pork, setting the stage for victory, or at least a lunch break. The Greeks even associated hospitality with salt. Sharing salt at a meal meant peace, fellowship, and a mutual understanding that no one would, for the duration of dinner anyway, throw a javelin. When someone broke that unspoken salted bread bond, it wasn't just impolite, it was practically cosmic treason. And then, of course, there were the salt pans, unnervingly geometric pools etched along the coasts, glinting under the sleepy Mediterranean sun like deconstructed mirrors. These tranquil basins, tended by workers with sun-leathered skin and philosophical patience, distilled drops of seawater into glimmering crystals, shimmering with potential and perspiration alike. Even Aristotle, master of many musings and a man with a beard wide enough to trap small birds, had something to say about salt. He noted salt in his natural observations, referring to it as both vital and mysterious, a substance formed by the action of heat on water, which, frankly, is a pretty good explanation for both salt and most Greek summers. But perhaps the most quaint role salt played in ancient Greece was in love and superstition. Brides were often anointed with salt as a symbol of purity and preservation, a kind of crunchy matrimonial blessing. Small children were sprinkled with it to ward off spirits, which probably didn't help the local ghost population, but certainly boosted the morale of home cooks. So there it was, salt, woven seamlessly into the fabric of Greek life, binding city-states together, seasoning democracy, and standing as a quiet guardian at the hub of science, superstition, and sautéed sardines. As the olive trees dozed beneath starlit skies and the Aegean waves hummed their ancient lullaby, Greece cradled this wondrous mineral with the kind of casual reverence only the wise and perpetually sun-kissed possess. Let's drift now, gently, across the shimmering seas, toward a land where salt would spark something far more flammable than philosophy. that old Roman thirst for power, empire, and salted roads. As dusk settled over the Roman Empire, and toga salesmen folded up their stalls, a quiet but sparkly white treasure kept history's wheels turning. Salt, common, humble, sometimes stuck between your teeth, was for the Romans what Wi-Fi is for the modern world. Nobody talked about it at parties, but the second it vanished, chaos would surely follow. The Romans were not the first to value salt, of course, but they were among history's most eloquently obsessed. They knew how to write poetry, build aqueducts, and conquer the known world, and do all three while keeping their fish impeccably salted. Salt was wealth, salt was power, and salt was rather inconvenient to transport in chariots, but we'll get to that. To understand the Roman love affair with salt, we need to pay a dreamy visit to the Via Salaria, Latin for, quite literally, the Salt Road. As cozy as it sounds, this ancient path wound its way from the glittering salt pans of Ostia all the way to the interior of the empire. It was used by Roman salt traders, or salinatores, long before Caesar even considered crossing his very inconvenient Rubicon. Imagine it. Dusty-legged merchants padded down the road, baskets brimming with briny crystals, muttering things like, "No, really, Marcus, this is top-grade sea salt, freshly evaporated." Salt wasn't just essential for seasoning a meal. It was pivotal for preserving fish, meats, and occasionally, egos. Because in a civilization without refrigerators or microwavable lasagnas, salt allowed Romans to eat well beyond the coastline. And of all Roman institutions elevated by salt, none stands proudly in the halo of historical irony like the Roman salary. The word salary itself comes from salarium, which, brace for trivia delight, was a stipend given to Roman soldiers, sometimes literally in salt or cash to buy salt. That's right. Ancient warriors marched into battle humming the equivalent of "I'm getting paid in table seasoning." Now, were legionaries thrilled about being paid with shiny flakes when they were expecting silver coins? Probably not. One imagines a few dramatic sword-point conversations, like, "Centurion, with all due respect, you promised coinage, not condiments." But over time, the salarium came to mean monetary pay, a slippery semantic shift as common as seagulls at a seaside fish market. To this day, when your paycheck hits the bank, you can whisper a thank you to Roman logistics and their pressing need to keep pork from smelling like regret. Salt even had its diplomatic moments. Treaties were sometimes sealed with exchanges of salt, which somehow sounds both meaningful and bland, a bit like modern international airport sandwiches. In Roman households, sharing salt was a gesture of friendship, a way of saying, "You are welcome here. Also, our olives taste wildly better this way." The emperor himself would have dined on seasoned delicacies. By the imperial era, Roman cuisine had been transformed by garum, a fermented fish sauce deeply reliant on salt, and if we're honest, fairly reliant on being acquired far from one's nose. This savory concoction was the ketchup of the Roman world, though instead of tomatoes, it involved aging fish entrails with salt until your dinner guests stopped asking questions. Economically, the Roman state kept a close and elegant grip on salt production. Salt pans were state-controlled or leased at a price, and the salt tax took its proper place among other creatively named oppressions. The Roman bureaucracy, much like a lasagna, had distinct layers, and somewhere in there, nestled among property levies and grain allotments, was the overseer of all things salty. And while we're already feeling how sleepily impressive that all is, let's drift quietly to the thought of Roman baths. Warm, misty, echoing with philosophical soapbox debates and minor splashing. Even their cleansing rituals, full of oils and scrapers and endless, slightly awkward social expectations, leaned on salt solutions to soothe the skin. Salt was in a sense everywhere and everything, from battlefield rations to humble soup pots and marble-columned spas. So next time you sprinkle flakes over a ripe tomato, or toss a pinch atop your popcorn, consider yourself part of a grand tradition. A line of salt shakers stretching back over centuries, whispering thank yous to weathered Roman merchants in sandals, and laughing gently at how a little mineral managed to flavor more than just food. And now, with the Via Salaria behind us and the scent of salted fish slowly receding into dream fog, we turn our gaze eastward, to a land where salt was not just a seasoning, but a currency written in desert winds and caravan bells. By the time salt wound its way into medieval Europe, it had already seen more passports than a Venetian merchant. But in the feudal lands of castles, chainmail, and rather questionable dental hygiene, salt found itself embroiled in a drama more subtle than battle cries, taxation. Now, while salt tax might sound about as thrilling as a muddy turnip harvest, it was, in truth, a quietly explosive powder keg. The French gleefully called their version of it the gabelle, which sounds lovely if you don't know. It made peasants groan louder than a blacksmith sitting on a hot anvil. The gabelle wasn't merely a tax. It was a full-blown government salt monopoly, mandatory, infuriating, and inescapable. Here's how it worked. The Crown decided that salt was too important to be left in the reckless hands of the common folk. So they rolled out a tidy little plan. Citizens in certain regions were required to buy a fixed amount of salt each year, whether they needed it, wanted it, or preferred their food dangerously bland. It didn't matter if your pantry was already a crystalline wonderland. You bought the salt, period. Worse still, folks couldn't legally produce or transport salt privately. The state did it all. That meant smuggling, a pastime usually reserved for more glamorous substances, became synonymous with crystals of sodium chloride. In some particularly high smuggle zones, one could witness a peasant trudging through the forest, clothes lined with the cleverest of contraband, concealed sacks of salt, sewn into linings and tucked into boots. Enter the faux saunier, a criminal not with daggers and jewels, but with clever hands and well-salted intentions. These illegal salt merchants became folk heroes of a sort, dodging taxmen and leaving trails of dignity and salt across France. Some villages even turned a blind eye, offering sanctuary, strong haylofts, and possibly a nice stew, especially if you were generous with the seasoning. The gabelle, mind you, wasn't spread evenly across France. Some regions had looser rates, others were nearly drowning in over-regulation. The ones with cheaper salt became hotbeds for smuggling into the more, shall we say, seasoned regions. As one can imagine, a black market grew faster than weeds in a monastery herb garden. By the 1700s, the gabelle had turned into one of the most resented taxes in all of France, right up there with the general loathing for powdered wigs and perpetual war debts. Even the philosophers of the Enlightenment, who probably couldn't cook a stew but certainly had thoughts, grumbled about it. Voltaire, for example, had little patience for a tax that turned fish preservation into a criminal enterprise. It wasn't only the French who took creative liberties with salt taxation. On the other side of the Alps, in the papal lands of what is now Italy, the Holy Father himself got into the salt business. That's right, the Pope had salt interests. Nothing unites the sacred and the savory quite like God's vicar levying fees on the seasoning of your pasta. And let's not forget Austria under the Habsburgs, whose swooping mustaches and insatiable appetite for regulation led to the creation of Salinen, state-operated salt works that squeezed every groschen out of the common brine. Salt had become a government darling. It didn't spoil. It didn't rot. It didn't gossip. It could be stored, endlessly and taxed indefinitely. A bureaucrat's dream in a mineral disguise. So what happens when you take a staple used in everything from food preservation to medieval medicine, and you trap it behind a paywall the size of Mount Jura? Well, for one, revolution starts whispering in the pantry. Frustration burrows quietly into the larded loaves of bakers and the simmering kettles of soap makers. Salt had seen itself transformed from a symbol of purity and preservation into a weighty, stale symbol of state control. It's one of history's great ironies that a mineral once used in sacred blessings would become the backbone of underground economies and a foothold for rebellion. Because while generals and kings might claim glory with galloping steeds and embroidered banners, the real trouble often starts with a simple question. Why does my fish cost this much? But before we set anyone storming a Bastille, or at least sharpening pitchforks out of culinary frustration, let's take a more comforting path. Next, we'll wander far from European stashes and into a drier, dustier world, where a golden white powder turned desert caravans into glittering trains of trade, and camels became kings of salt. If you wandered into the bustling markets of Venice during the 14th century, you might have been knocked sideways not by a pickpocket, but by a whiff of something both sacred and fishy. Salt cod, or as the Venetians called it, bacala. It wasn't elegant, and it certainly wasn't alive anymore, but it was yet another deliciously bland indicator of salt's quiet dominion over trade, religion, and, unexpectedly, international diplomacy. Not bad for a mineral composed of two atoms trying to mind their own ionic business. Venice, that watery city-state of masked carnivals and suspiciously enthusiastic gondoliers, had long discovered that power didn't always come from swords or silk, but sometimes from sacks of salt, hauled by sturdy boats and sunburned sailors. Salt was the lifeblood of La Serenissimi's maritime empire. Not because it made things taste better, though thank goodness it did, but because it made things last. In an age before refrigeration, and well before soy-based freezer meals, salting a fish was the closest thing to putting it on pause. You see, the Mediterranean's hot temperament wasn't great for preserving food. Fish spoiled faster than a royal nephew, and meat didn't fare much better. But once the Venetians began mastering the art of preserving with salt, and more importantly, monopolizing it, they found themselves in a most enviable position. Little white crystals meant goods that could travel, goods that could be traded, and eventually, a navy that could stomp on pirates while politely sipping wine. Their salt trade monopoly extended far beyond Venice's bobbing canals. The city acquired the salt pans of Chioggia, a small Venetian town, whose name sounds like someone sneezing during a funeral, but whose salt output underpinned much of the Republic's economic clout. These lagoons produce sun-evaporated sea salt in great gleaming mounds, tended by men whose tan lines belonged in epic poetry. And what did Venice do with its surplus of salt? Oh, just fund the most impressively smug merchant fleet in history, secure exclusive trade deals with the Byzantine Empire, and irritate every envious European power that didn't think to hoard brine-soaked fish scales. But let us not forget the ecclesiastical twist. The church had rules, specifically about fasting, which ironically made salted fish not only convenient, but almost saintly. On Fridays and during Lent, when meat was off the table, preserved fish became divine loopholes. Suddenly, salt cod wasn't just food, it was piety on a plate. Gnawing on a dried salted fish was a verifiable act of holiness, which is probably why no one complained about the taste, or the smell, or the fact that once rehydrated, salt cod had the texture of a tired book sleeve. And speaking of spiritual matters, Venice wasn't alone in the fishy side of faith. Up in Scandinavia, Vikings had long practiced salting and drying cod on wooden racks in the wind. When the Hanseatic League, a sort of medieval European Costco, got in on the act, salt cod became the IKEA of its day. Cheap, practical, and infinitely flat packable. Thanks to these lumpy bundles of dried optimism, entire trade routes bloomed like crusty flowers along the Atlantic. Portuguese sailors adopted it, Basques perfected it, and everyone with a boat had a vested interest in keeping it salty, which also explains why so many sea battles were fought in cloudy weather about vats of fish. Back in Venice, the Salt Office, yes, a real institution, regulated the salt trade with the same passion some devote to spreadsheets. Smuggling salt was not simply frowned upon. It was prosecuted with the kind of fury reserved only for heresy and excessively loud opera. The state needed its salt taxes. After all, who else was going to pay for those splendidly awkward wigs in the Doge's palace? There were secret tunnels, coded contracts, and a whole genre of salty intrigue. Because when you control salt, you don't just manage seasoning, you hold sway over preservation, religion, wealth, and accidentally, the entire fish situation in Europe. So the next time you see a sleepy canal bathed in moonlight, imagine it not as the setting of a romantic gondola ride, but as the lifeblood of salt politics. Cloaked merchants exchanging barrels in the fog, ragged sailors toasting with briny wine, all blessed by a city that rose from the sea and decided to never really stop being wet. Now, let your thoughts bob gently alongside those Venetian boats, drifting lazily toward the open sea, where salt story carries us ever onward, with a light breeze and quieter waves. In a quiet corner of the Nordic past, where snow falls like powdered sugar and daylight is something of a fleeting rumor, there lived a people whose very survival depended on salt, though they probably never stopped mid-fjord to write poems about it. The Vikings, those brazen bearded travelers of myth and rune, are often imagined in bursts of noisy raiding and boat-shaking mischief. But amidst the horned helmet misconceptions and dramatic sea spray, there lies a rather understated tale of salt, the crystalline quiet partner to every smoked fish and preserved hunk of mutton they consumed on their long voyages. You see, before refrigeration, and we must add, long before the fridges had smart touchscreens that could recommend oat milk, meat preservation was a matter of critical importance. For the Norse seafarer, who might spend considerable time rowing to unknown lands just to dramatically disembark and say, "This is mine now," having provisions was not optional. Enter salt, the storeroom MVP of the Viking world. But here's the inconvenient truth. Scandinavia is, geologically speaking, a little stingy when it comes to accessible salt deposits. There weren't exactly mountains filled with salt awaiting the first Nordic entrepreneurs. Instead, they had to resort to sea salt, laboriously extracted from the very waters they sailed upon. It was a bit like trying to stay dry while embracing the ocean, only slightly more exhausting and with a much saltier aftertaste. To obtain it, the Vikings would boil seawater in large iron pans, letting the water evaporate and leave behind the precious white crystals. This process required fuel, lots of it, and time. neither of which were available in great abundance when snow was falling sideways and bears were looking at you like dinner with eyebrows. So what did they do? Well, being practical people who didn't mind a bit of importing, they traded. The Norse were not just berserkers with an axe to grind. They were enthusiastic merchants as well. Salt from more Central European sources, like the rich salt mines in Germany or the evaporated pan salts of Celtic Gaul, made its way up to the frozen reaches of Norway and Iceland through an enterprising network of trade routes. Essentially, Viking groceries were sourced from rather distant supermarkets. The role of salt in Viking society extended beyond sausaging the scray. Salt-preserved seafood allowed for long maritime journeys, not just the pillagey ones, but the more charmingly adventurous ones too. Explorers like Leif Erikson, who probably packed salted cod for his trip across the Atlantic, wouldn't have lasted 5 metaphorical minutes without those salt-packed rations keeping them nourished and not entirely scurvy-shaped. But there's an even cozier element to the Viking salt story that often gets overlooked. The home hearth. In winter months, a salted cut of reindeer meat hanging above a smoky fire wasn't just dinner, it was a promise. A promise that no matter how many trolls lived up the mountain, or how finicky the weather became, things would be all right, because dinner was safely aging in peace. A very Nordic sort of optimism. It's funny to think, the very same people whose historic reputation includes setting monasteries ablaze also spent quiet evenings tending piles of saltfish like responsible middle managers of domestic supply chains. Behind the bravado of the sagas, there were dwarven tales of dried herring and accurate logs of cured leg counts. Of course, the Vikings didn't merely eat salty things, they introduced them as well. Landing in new territories, settling along riverbanks, they brought their methods of preservation with them. So if you've ever found yourself wondering why the pickled herring industry of the modern Baltic coast is so robust, you might spare a salty nod of thanks to our northern mariners of yore. As the ships faded into fog and the salted barrels sloshed quietly in their holds, the echo of a Viking lullaby was more likely to involve the steady drip of brine than the clang of sword on shield. Salt, ever subtle, ever silent, continued its journey, not with thunder, but with the soft whisper of preservation. Eventually, however, the concept of salt would intersect with something a bit more unsettling than smoked trout, namely empire. But that tale too begins with a grain. As twilight unfurled its dusty blue shawl across the Mediterranean, the Romans continued marching not only across continents, but across culinary history. These were the people who could build aqueducts, forge empires, and yet still found themselves obsessed with seasoning their fish. And not just any seasoning. Oh no, the Romans had discovered something that would unite emperors, peasants, and prattling poets alike. Garum. Ah, garum. The pungent perfume of power and protein. Imagine, if you will, a sauce made from fermented fish intestines, salt, and the audacity to call it delicious. To the ancient Romans, this wasn't some peculiar culinary misstep. This was gold in a jar. Let's drift now into the salty winds of Pompeii, where oceans whispered against stone walls, amphorae stood like sleepy sentinels, and garum, yes, that fishy elixir, was brewed in vast vats beneath the scorching Italian sun. The process was gloriously simple and disturbingly aromatic. Small fish, entrapped by unfortunate career choices, were layered with salt and left out to ferment. Not for a day, not for a week, but for months. Months during which the Mediterranean heat coiled itself around the mixture like a determined python, encouraging it to bubble, sizzle, and finally separate into a liquid of alarming clarity. Distillers, if one could generously apply that word, would drain the resulting golden fluid and bottle it with Latin pride. This liquid, this garum, was slathered on everything: bread, meat, vegetables, even fruit. It was the Worcestershire sauce of an empire, if Worcestershire sauce had a secret life as a fishy potion of social prestige. And yes, your status could rely, in part, on the kind of garum you served at dinner parties. There were, of course, variations. At the top tier was liquamen, the refined cousin of garum. Then there was alec, the murky, gritty sludge left at the bottom of the vat, usually reserved for those whose togas had seen better days. The very finest blends came, famously, from a town called Gades, modern-day Cadiz in Spain, where garum was so lucrative it paid for marble columns and poorly planned orgies. Salt was the essential ingredient in this entire alchemical adventure, not just because it preserved the fish, but because it controlled the fermentation, prevented spoilage, and, oddly enough, created something genuinely craved by Roman palates. Salt turned decay into delicacy. You can practically hear a Roman noble at the banquet table, swirling his goblet of wine and declaring, "Ah, yes, the garum is particularly zesty this year. Tastes just faintly of Neptune's armpit. Splendid." What's remarkable is not merely that people ate garum, it's that they traded it across empires. Amphorae of garum were shipped to Gaul, to Britannia, and as far as Mesopotamia. Ships groaned under its weight. Inns advertised it with painted signs. And on street corners, vendors may well have shouted something quite close to, "Garum, fresh garum. One taste and you'll forget you're eating pickled anchovy juice." Salt merchants teamed up with garum makers, forming early supply chains that echoed today's global logistics. Though, to be fair, today's freight doesn't usually smell like 10,000 decaying mackerels. But the principle, the same. Salt was the silent partner in this imperial flavor conquest. That said, not everyone was charmed. Pliny the Elder, the ever-watchful uncle of antiquity, commented with his usual blend of awe and eyebrow-raising skepticism. He explained the process in his writings, likely while quietly holding his nose. And Seneca, the philosopher who had opinions on nearly everything, probably raised a disapproving brow or two, though even Seneca might have reached for a garum-laced fig when no one was watching. It wasn't just about taste, it was about commerce, class, and culinary conquest. Salt transformed perishable fish into something eternal, or at least long-lived enough to survive the voyage to the Roman frontier. Those who controlled salt controlled garum, and those who controlled garum, well, they controlled dinner, and perhaps just a little piece of the Roman heart. As the stars blinked like sleepy sentinels above Pompeii's tiled courtyards, the scent of garum no doubt still lingered in the air long after the plates were cleared and the wine was gone. Somewhere, a merchant counted his salt-stained earnings. Somewhere else, a cook stirred a pot and hoped for that perfect pungent tang. And far beyond that, new roads of salt and flavor were quietly unwinding toward distant, spiced horizons. Somewhere in the misty folds of the medieval world, nestled between long-forgotten edicts and very enthusiastic plagues, there was an idea quietly brining itself to life. Salt as taxation. You see, kings and emperors, being human and quite fond of money, realized that salt wasn't just a mineral, it was a logistical goldmine. And so, as if inspired one dreary afternoon by the bottom of a royal porridge bowl, they asked themselves, what if we made people pay for using this stuff they need to survive? Tragically for the common stomach and gloriously for accountants everywhere, they did just that. Let us float gently now to France, a land of elegant cheeses, complicated sauces, and revolutionaries with a tendency to carry pitchforks. Back in the 14th century, the French monarchy introduced what came to be known as the gabelle, an evocative name, if ever one was conjured, meaning salt tax. It was as fun to live under as it sounds. Now, unlike, say, a parking ticket, the gabelle was not applied evenly. Oh no, that would be rational. In France, certain provinces received salt at reasonable rates or were even exempt, while others, known as the Pays de Grande Gabelle, were forced to buy a fixed amount of salt every year, whether they needed it or not. Imagine being guilted by your government into hoarding salt the way your aunt hoards expired spices. This mandatory salt buying wasn't polite. It came with inspections, record keeping, and charming consequences like imprisonment for non-compliance. Yes, dear dreamer, the French could handle garlic, but they would not stand for a saltless economy. Or so His Majesty thought. Of course, as with most things that are both inconvenient and deeply unjust, people did exactly what you'd expect. They smuggled, with style. Salt smugglers, known as faux sauniers, or literally fake salters, emerged like rebellious grains from under chateau walls and vineyard shadows. Whole trade routes existed just for scoffing at the tax. Men, women, even children darted through forests, lugging sacks of contraband salt like a medieval episode of a cooking show gone rogue. In one corner, you had a peasant trying to season their turnips without arrest. In the other, royal salt inspectors sniffing around like particularly cranky sommelier detectives. Imagine the bedtime brawls over seasoning rights. Jacques, I swear to St. Catherine, if you hid the salt behind the fake chamber pot again, I will tell the magistrate myself. The gabelle grew only more resented as centuries drifted by. By the time of the French Revolution in 1789, salt wasn't just a mineral anymore. It was symbolic. It represented the dried-out tongue of every citizen thirsty for fairness. The revolution brought many changes, some of them involving very rapid haircuts courtesy of the guillotine, and among those was the blessed abolition of the salt tax. Briefly, and yet in a charming twist that only history can manage, Napoleon Bonaparte, patron saint of tall hats and short tempers, brought the tax back. Because no empire is built on dreams alone. Some, it seems, require heavy seasoning. A similar story unfolded in other parts of the world, though the details often had their own local flair. In India, for instance, British colonists imposed a salt tax stringent enough to spark a salt-powered civil disobedience campaign. But hush now, we'll drift there soon, to candle-lit marches and pinches of protest. Salt, once just a quiet necessity, became a noisy symbol. With it came questions. Who controls what you consume? Who can demand your dinner be bland unless you pay up? And what exactly does a salt smuggler wear? Probably a cloak, and probably not enough deodorant. Not that there was deodorant. And so, as we leave France, trailing behind us a soft crunch of rebellion and perhaps a bay leaf of justice, we follow salt's scent toward lands even farther east, where crystal beds shimmer in Himalayan caves, and the British Empire begins preparing its linen suits and accusatory bureaucracy. Gently now we go, under a violet dusk, when the air was still flavored with wood smoke and the low hum of distant livestock. Medieval monasteries became surprisingly vibrant centers of salt production. Yes, while monks are better known for manuscripts, chants, and spirited debates about the color of divine light, they were also quite the salt entrepreneurs. It's not the most obvious side hustle, but then again, nothing says holy order like savvy sultan management. In coastal abbeys stretching from the misty shores of Britain to the sun-washed rivieras of the Mediterranean, monastic communities mastered the art of transforming seawater into shimmering white crystals. Though they took vows of silence, poverty, and obedience, no one said anything about passing up a solid business model. After all, one does need resources to keep the chapel roof from collapsing under the weight of theological discussions. The process was marvelously meditative. Seawater gathered in shallow clay ponds would be slowly evaporated by the sun. An act of nature so gradual, it made Byzantine diplomacy look snappy by comparison. Each morning, the monks would pace through the salt pans in silence, robes dragging like the tide, observing the briny waters with a level of spiritual attention most people now reserve for phone screens. When the salt crystals finally emerged, glinting like tiny relics of the ocean's soul, the monks would rake them gently with tools that could have doubled as instruments of penance. Bags of salt were carefully measured, not too much, not too little, and traded for bread, wool, or that ever-sacred staple, monastery wine. They may have lived without gold-plated chalices or jewel-encrusted goblets, but by heavens, they always had a decent cheese cellar. And their customers, travelers, pilgrims, and neighboring townsfolk, many of whom were deeply grateful that the local monks cared as much about seasoning stew as they did about saving souls. The idea of divine preservation took on two meanings, one for spirits, the other for smoked fish. Some abbeys became renowned not just for theological scholarship, but for their particularly fine grind of salt. There stood St. Leontius of Camargue, a mostly forgotten monk whose manuscript commentary on Job was famously dense, but whose sea salt was so well balanced it made spoiled venison palatable. That's a miracle in itself. But this wasn't just a medieval curiosity. It reflected a wider truth. Salt didn't just preserve fish or flavor porridge. It funded bells, books, and bread. In many cases, it quietly underwrote centuries of architecture and invention. Quietly, the way moss creeps over old stonework, or the way monks settled doctrinal disputes over surprisingly salty oatcakes. These humble harvesting operations could influence regional economies. Entire villages cropped up near monastic salterns because when monks make your salt, you're guaranteed purity in both mineral and motive. Though, to be fair, some abbots didn't mind a bit of opportunism wrapped in sanctity. Salt, as always, had a way of making people flexible with their ethics. There were even episodes where disputes over salt rights ended in ecclesiastical squabbles. One bishop allegedly accused a rival archbishop of hoarding the Lord's brine. Yes, holy turf wars over sodium chloride. The liturgy was solemn, but the pantry politics positively zesty. Further inland, salt wasn't as easily obtained, and that made these monastic stocks even more valuable. Caravans would travel great distances to secure their share. One letter, preserved in a monastery archive in Burgundy, details a merchant offering 6 lambskins and a silver ring, in the hopes of acquiring just 2 sacks. He also added a generous note about the heavenly character of the monk's lentil stew. A little flattery, salted well, can go a long way. And of course, there were the inevitable rumors. Some claimed certain monks were given divine visions of salt pans glowing under moonlight. Others whispered that relics of obscure saints had the miraculous power to prevent salted meat from ever going off. Convenient, certainly. Whether spiritual or just a well-timed cold breeze from the Alps, we'll never know. But as the sun dipped low and candles flickered across cloisters, a different kind of alchemy unfolded. Salt was poured into ceramic jars, locked away in storerooms beside wax-sealed chronicles and bottles of monk-brewed mead. It slept through the centuries, patiently enduring while empires rose and fell like so many loaves in proofing bowls. So the next time you sprinkle a little sea salt on your eggs, spare a grateful thought for the robe-clad alchemists who once laboured quietly in tide-kissed fields. They kept both meat and memory from spoiling, and while salt made its humble way through cloisters and cathedrals, over mountains and palaces, it was only a matter of time before more ambitious hands reached for it, hands with royal seals and imperial ambitions. But those, my dear dreamer, we shall meet soon enough, in the low hills of ancient China, where bamboo rustled like whispers and rivers sang lullabies to passing clouds. Salt held yet another quiet kingdom, a mineral of paradox, utterly commonplace, yet endlessly powerful. Unlike the thundering empires of Rome and the crimson banners of the Mediterranean salt routes, here in Asia, salt was less a roaring juggernaut and more a serenely stubborn aristocrat. It didn't shout, didn't strut, it simply sat, quietly accumulating influence like a philosopher in a long robe with inscrutable opinions and very good tea. One of the earliest recorded saltworks in the world flourished in the Chinese province of Sichuan. Sichuan, famous today for making your tongue feel like it's hosting a fireworks display during nap time. But before peppercorns had their heyday, it was the briny crystals beneath the soil that made the region glisten with wealth. The Chinese, clever and unhurried in their approach, had tapped into one of nature's hidden tricks, underground brine. While other civilizations busied themselves scraping salt off rocks or coaxing it from the sea by drying puddles, with the sun's fond regard, the people of Sichuan drilled, yes, drilled, into the earth, with bamboo. Bamboo may not scream industrial machinery at first glance, but don't let its leafy leisureware fool you. For millennia, bamboo was the Swiss army knife of East Asia, capable of becoming anything from scaffolding to furniture to ominously squeaky musical flutes. But in this case, hollow bamboo poles were ingeniously joined end to end and inserted deep into the ground to reach brine-rich wells, some plunging over 1,000 feet beneath the earth, tickling salt water usually reserved for subterranean salamanders and grains who enjoyed a good sulk. And so, beginning around 2,000 years ago, the Chinese began evaporating this brine to make piles of conical white treasure. But they were not content to simply evaporate the brine in clay pans like a bunch of Neolithic interns. No, the laborious evaporation was powered with natural gas. Yes, natural gas. Long before European salons debated combustion and Boyle fiddled with his pressure chambers, the Chinese were lighting underground geysers of methane on fire to boil their salt water. Salt and fire from the same mysterious depths. Tell me that doesn't sound like a fantasy novel waiting to happen. And yet, it wasn't dragons or dwarves doing it. It was just regular people with bamboo, patience, and highly flammable local geology. But the magic didn't stop at extraction. Salt in imperial China was more than vital. It was, you might say, the empire's quiet tax accountant. As centralized governments emerged, especially from the time of the Han Dynasty onward, salt became a state monopoly. You know it's important when the emperor says, "From now on, you can't just go around seasoning things without checking with me." And so salt joined its bureaucratic sibling, iron, in the mighty duo known as the items the state gets very touchy about. Want to boil water with flammable air and extract salty sediment? Great. Fill out forms in triplicate and prepare for inspections. It wasn't just about shaking a bit onto fried tofu. The salt tax went on to fund roads, walls, armies, basically the empire's to-do list. In fact, over centuries, the salt tax became one of the key sources of revenue for countless dynasties. A pinch of salt here, a silver coin there. Before you knew it, entire dynasties were being quietly underwritten by stir-fried vegetables and soy sauce preservation. This was not a monopoly without resistance, of course. Smugglers emerged like seasoning shadows in the night, enterprising sorts who carried miniature mountains of contraband in sacks sewn into their sleeves. They risked imperial punishment, yes, but also flavored the black market with a sort of briny bravado. Imagine whispering conspiratorially, "I know a guy who knows a guy who can get you the good stuff," and it comes in a little ceramic jar. And still, salt reigned. Governments changed, dynasties rose and fell like reeds in the wind, but salt held steady, dripping out of valves or simmering in pans beside fire-lighting methane, sliding across trade routes on the backs of grumpy camels and mildly perplexed mules. It is no exaggeration to say that salt helped bind the vast Chinese empire, not just in flavor, but in funds, in fuel, and in that age-old human habit of finding something essential, bottling it, taxing it, and pretending this will solve everything. And as the salt fires flickered beneath Sichuan's misty mountains and bureaucrats debated the day's brine quotas, history, once again, turned not on kings or battles, but on tiny crystals and the uncanny human ability to make them both profitable and poetic. Soon we drift westward once more, toward Eastern Europe, where salt would dig not only into cave walls, but deep into the very heart of feudal economies. Legend says that in some parts of medieval Europe, salt was once so precious it was nicknamed white gold, which, if we're being literal, is the worst kind of gold, visually confusing and sneeze-inducing, but metaphorically, it says quite a bit. This unassuming crystal, tucked away in the folds of the earth or dancing on the tips of evaporating shores, wasn't just a seasoning. It was status. It was power. It was also occasionally a symbol for how few spices people could get their hands on in feudal England. Now, let us drift quietly into the dining halls of the Middle Ages, where salt didn't just flavor the food, it flavored the entire social structure. Enter the phrase, above the salt. You see, in great banquet halls, the salt would be placed in a very specific spot on the long dining table, usually in the center. Those of high rank sat above the salt. Those of lower status, below it. It was dinner table geography with imperial consequences, and perhaps a passive-aggressive way to remind your guests where they stood, in both a literal and social sense. Imagine being invited to dine at a lord's manor and being seated below the salt. You'd be stuck with tepid mead, someone's cousin who spoke exclusively in goose metaphors, and a view of pickled turnips from 1273. But above the salt, that was where the roasted boar was tender, the gossip was juicy, and someone maybe had, dare we whisper it, pepper, spicy scandal. This edible prestige wasn't limited to the dinner table. In Venice, a city where the streets were made of water and commerce flowed like gondolas after wine, salt fueled empires. Ironically, despite being surrounded by it, the Venetians didn't just rely on seawater and good vibes. No, their salt empire was orchestrated with the subtlety of a string quartet and the ambition of a bored cat. They monopolized the salt trade with such finesse that politicians today would blush. Venetian merchants established salt production sites along the Adriatic coast, and demanded teeth-clenching tariffs from anyone daring to transport salt through their waters. Want to ship salt past Venice? Pay up. Want to blink in the direction of a salt map? There's a fee for that too. For centuries, the entire city thrived because everybody needed salt, and Venice controlled the tap. But they weren't the only ones in on the game. The French constructed the gabelle, a salt tax so hated it partially contributed to the French Revolution. Yes, because nothing says liberté, égalité, fraternité, like shouting about seasoning. The gabelle wasn't merely a tax. It was a bureaucratic labyrinth. People were required by law to buy a certain amount of salt every year, regardless of need. Children who could barely hold a spoon were counted in a family's salt quota. And not just any salt, mind you. Only the government's salt, priced like it had been carted on the backs of unicorns. This rigid demand led to, what else? Salt smuggling. Brave, bold smugglers, known as faux sauniers, emerged. Mostly normal citizens with an unusual addiction to black market brining. They'd sneak around with tiny barrels tucked under carts of hay or beneath freshly caught fish, dodging royal salt inspectors, who presumably had the least interesting uniforms in all of France. Some of these inspectors were vigilantly zealous, busting open flour sacks or poking loaves of bread on suspicion of crystalline contraband. One wonders how many perfectly good pastries were lost in pursuit of this mineral justice. Yet despite the tension, the absurdity, and the occasional salt-based imprisonment, it was remarkably human. Civilizations rising and falling, all while squabbling over the thing that makes soup taste good. What wars were fought over spices? What lives changed for gold? But here was salt, humbly handed down from sea and soil, quietly shaping law, trade routes, and lunch. So next time you sprinkle a dash across your dinner, know you wield something that once orchestrated revolts and shaped empires. A curious relic, still glinting on your fries. Now we shall drift onward, not to war, not to kitchens, but to a place high above sea level, where salt whispered a different kind of magic. Evening strolled across the desert plains of North Africa with the lazy elegance of a drowsy camel. The wind carried the scent of sand and salt, always the salt, deep in the Sahara, long before our modern notions of GPS or Amazon Prime. Human beings went to extraordinary lengths to secure the world's favorite mineral. And by extraordinary lengths, I mean strapping enormous slabs of salt onto even more enormous camels, trotting in caravans that resembled mobile furniture stores, and crossing a sun-blistered wasteland for weeks. All for the stuff you now casually spill next to your fries. This was the age of the trans-Saharan salt trade, a slow-motion drama of economics, ecology, and sore feet. In what is now Mali, the city of Timbuktu rose like a beige phoenix from the sands. It wasn't just a faraway place your uncle joked about getting lost in. It was once a thriving epicenter of knowledge, trade, and yes, salted wealth. You see, in West Africa, particularly in the Sahel region, there was no sea to speak of, and thus no sea water to evaporate into seasoning. Yet paradise does not deal in flavorless stews. So salt had to come from the north, across that sunny oven known as the Sahara. To the north, in the region we now call the Taoudeni mines of modern-day Mali, and earlier Tagaza. Men labored under the cloudless agony of the sky, hacking salt slabs from ancient beds with such devotion that it bordered on the absurd. These weren't delicate flakes or twinkly sea crystals. These were slabs the size of large cutting boards, weighing about 60 pounds apiece. Each one looked like something IKEA might sell under the name Zeltblok. These blocks were traded southward over 1,000 desert miles. Caravans, often hundreds of camels long, plodded steadily from one oasis to another like very slow, extremely patient trains with humps. Riders wore blue-tinted garments, not for fashion, mind you, but to keep their skin from becoming a convincing impersonation of leather-bound encyclopedias. What made salt so worth the camel back-breaking journey wasn't just its taste, it was its function. In a time before refrigeration, back when meat was only fresh if you caught it before lunch, salt was the original MVP of food preservation. Fish, meat, even cheese owed their longevity to salt's magical bacteria-thwarting powers. Entire harvests could be saved, market stalls stocked, and trade networks preserved with salted goods. It was the edible spell that kept spoilage at bay. So valuable was this mineral that gold and salt were sometimes traded pound for pound. Imagine that. Shiny yellow metal exchanged for white grainy slabs. Today, it sounds ludicrous, but if you're a merchant with a cart full of goat and no freezer, your priorities shift fast. Gold won't keep your goat from becoming fuzzy at the corners. And Timbuktu, it grew rich and wise on this saline tide. Great libraries emerged, housing manuscripts on astronomy, law, and philosophy. Much of it funded by caravans that jingled with both gold coins and crusty mineral wafers. Salt nourished not just bodies, but minds, providing the financial backbone for centers of learning where scholars debated the placement of stars and the shape of justice. Even the Roman writer Pliny the Elder, our eternal cosmic gossip, once noted that in some regions, salt is valued like gold. Of course, this was right before he gallivanted toward an erupting Mount Vesuvius, but, well, that's another tale. Back in Africa, kings grew fabulously wealthy from taxing the salt trade. The mighty Ghana Empire, followed by the Mali Empire, and then Songhai, all took their salty royalty from the caravans they hosted. It was a kind of mineral toll booth, less beep beep, more clop clop. So the next time you pass a salt shaker at dinner, give a distant nod to the camel driver squinting under the Saharan sun, dreaming of shade, dates, and maybe, just maybe, a lunch that doesn't taste like dust. And speaking of flavors that shaped continents, our dreams now beckon us toward a certain famous empire where roads were lined not with gold, but salted fish and bureaucratic ambition. It was a mild evening in Venetian territory. Well, as mild as anything could be, in a city constructed almost entirely on stilts and swampy bravado. The 15th century had unrolled itself over Europe like a slightly damp quilt, and somewhere amidst that ever-damp tapestry, salt was up to its old tricks, building empires, sinking ships, seasoning trade deals just as much as it did dinners. Venice, the so-called Queen of the Adriatic, had an affinity for salt that bordered on romance. You see, long before glass chandeliers and gondolier ballads became their primary exports, the Venetians were wheeling and dealing in white gold. No, not sugar. The other white gold. Salt. Now, salt was tricky business in the lagoon. The city couldn't exactly dig deep for it. It is surrounded, after all, by water so salty, it sometimes tries to pickle the bricks. But evaporation, that was Venice's ticket. They perfected salt pans along the lagoon's brackish arms, laboring patiently beneath the sun until the seas themselves surrendered their crystals. And oh, did Venice parlay those glittering grains into power. By the late Middle Ages, they had positioned themselves as the salt brokers of the Mediterranean. Sort of like if an entire city had become your one eccentric friend who knows where to get the best coffee beans and insists on telling you the story of each bean's grandparent. only with more corruption and slightly fewer social boundaries. Now, through the Saline da Comacchio and Chioggia, Venice didn't just meet local demand. They began exporting the stuff up the Po River into the cold, salt-hungry bellies of Central Europe. Places like Austria and Bavaria, where the pickling of cabbage was becoming less of a grim necessity and more of a culinary adventure. In this scene enters the character of Gabelle, the infamous salt tax. You might think of it as a bureaucratic sneeze that somehow turned into a hurricane. Across Europe, various regions had clamped onto the idea that if salt was vital, it ought to be taxed extravagantly. Venice, never one to settle for last place in the race for profit, created their own version of the salt monopoly. So around 1460, the Venetian government took full control. Salt depots sprang up like powdered mushrooms. Warehouse vaults appeared that could safely store fortunes in sodium, and inspectors fussed over the product like nervous pastry chefs. If you so much as hinted at bringing foreign salt into Venice, you could expect a fine, a stern talking to, and possibly being turned around at the dock like an underdressed party crasher. To maintain their crystal empire, Venetians also cunningly negotiated with rivals and allies alike. Not out of love, of course. Diplomacy, in the Venetian lexicon, meant get your salt from us, or find your ships mysteriously sinking in the night. Merchants found their wagons searched, captains had their holds inspected, and the salt routes grew as heavily policed as a Venetian gala with free wine. Legend has it, a man once tried to smuggle French salt disguised as Italian flour through the region, only to be foiled by a parrot who kept saying "sacré bleu" every time someone opened the bag. The story may not be entirely true, but it does explain why parrots were banned from most customs posts thereafter. It's easy, from the haze of our modern spice racks, to forget that entire wars were justified over substances now sitting quietly in your shaker. But Venice knew better. Their salt didn't just preserve fish and flavor soup, it preserved status, held power, and flavored treaties that outlasted dynasties. As night deepens over the softly swaying canals, one can almost hear the echo of traders calling to each other, the slap of water against salt-laden barges, the rustle of sailcloth, and the rustle of coin purses. Salt was the quiet architect behind their glories, and occasionally their intrigues. And as Venice banked on its brine, far to the north another kingdom was sharpening its own salt blade, not whisked in wind over warm waters, but carved from deep mountain caverns, crystal by crystal, pick by pick, secret by centuries. Let's drift there next. As the shadowy mists of history drifted into the 16th century, salt, our quiet white protagonist, found itself navigating waters both literal and political. Not that salt could navigate, being rather notoriously unsail-like, but you get the idea. The age of exploration had dawned, and Europe had decided the best way to understand the world was to publicly bicker over it and send ships to name every beach, after someone named Ferdinand. Sea captains were scrambling to discover spice routes, gold mines, and anything else that sparkled or tasted better than turnips. But in this maritime mess, salt was enjoying a bit of a revival, possibly lounging in the sun on the bow of a Portuguese carrack, invisible but essential. You see, once men began spending months bobbing on the ocean, hoping to bump into Java or something with elephants, they faced a very practical culinary crisis: how to not die from putrefying goat meat somewhere off the coast of Madagascar. Enter salt, the original food influencer. Salt preservation techniques allowed sailors to carry salted cod, beef, pork, and even something ambiguously called ship's biscuit, which was ironically neither biscuit nor fit for any ship. The salted cod story, in particular, is something of a legend. Cod, that noble slab of North Atlantic fish, became a sort of holy grail of maritime supermarkets. When dried and salted, it transformed from a floppy ocean dweller into a flat, leathery sheet with the shelf life of a marble statue. Europe's Catholic nations especially adored it. With meat banned on religious fast days, of which there were roughly 6,000, salted cod was the saint-approved protein of choice. Even Martin Luther, while protesting most other things, probably didn't mind a nice bit of baccalao. Portugal, France, Spain, and England all scrambled for access to cod-rich waters, eventually discovering the Grand Banks off Newfoundland. The cod there was so abundant, sailors claimed they could scoop it from the sea with buckets, although, as with all fish tales, this may have involved some enthusiastic exaggeration. In any case, salt and cod became inseparable, a classic duo like cheese and wine, or boredom and meetings. But all this preserving required salt, and lots of it. So as much as Columbus set sail in search of gold in India, many expeditions were secretly just salt distribution projects with better hats. Salt works sprang up in colonial territories. The Caribbean became a key zone for salt production, where the sun beat down generously upon salt pans, turning seawater to salt the good old-fashioned way, with relentless solar tyranny. In particular, the Dutch carved out salt harvesting installations on islands like Bonaire, feeding the appetites of Europe's rapidly growing herring industry. Yes, salted herring. An entire empire was mildly fishy and curiously pungent. Imagine a business model where your nation's wealth depends on the preservation of slippery aquatic creatures. That was the Dutch Golden Age. Truly, commerce has never smelled weirder. Even colonial rivalries were spiced, pardon the pun, by salt. The British, never ones to leave a lucrative mineral unbothered, took to controlling salt routes and production across their holdings. In India, for example, they implemented harsh salt taxes, which would, centuries later, lead to one Mr. Gandhi taking a rather famous seaside stroll. But those revolts were still distant clouds. For now, salt quietly churned the gears of empire. It lay in barrels below deck, in warehouse stacks, in wooden scoops heaving it onto fish across docks from Lisbon to London. It was as invisible to the average merchant as the ink in their shipping ledgers, indispensable and unintentionally poetic. And with preservation came power. Whoever controlled the salt controlled food. Whoever controlled the food, well, got invited to dinner, in a sense. By the late 1500s, even Shakespeare might have wryly tasted history's maritime salt. After all, one of his plays involves a daughter proving her love by saying she loves her father as fresh meat loves salt. A peculiar line, unless you're surrounded by sailors who regard a smoked haddock with the sort of reverence usually reserved for saints or celestial bodies. So as Europe's vessels crisscrossed the globe in search of spice, they trailed a vapor of salt behind them, not just on the decks and in the holds, but in law, religion, economics, and the endless effort to keep things from rotting at sea. Salt was the unsinkable sailor, a pinch in the belly of every empire, as steady and invisible as the tides. And speaking of tides, they're about to carry us to an unlikely frontier, an industrial movement where brine becomes big business and the quiet white crystal takes a smoky, steamy turn toward mechanization. But first, let's gently drift with the waves a little longer. As the candle-lit centuries rolled into the age of enlightenment, salt, ever the quiet accomplice to empire building and roast seasoning alike, found itself mingling with wigs, waistcoats, and the strange idea that perhaps reason should be more fashionable than superstition. Skepticism was swirling with tea leaves. Telescopes were pointed at stars instead of superstitions, and people began to ask the sort of questions that get you politely exiled, or occasionally revolution. But even in this age of rational thought, humanity's salty love affair remained delightfully irrational. Let's drift gently but curiously into the royal kitchens of 18th century Europe. Here, amid the clinking of copper pots and the subtle power plays of pastry chefs, salt was being reborn not merely as a preservative, but as a symbol of culinary civility. French cuisine, that delicate tapestry stitched together with butter and bravado, idolized salt as what it truly is: a coaxer of flavors, a maker of magic. Chefs in powdered wigs, whose hairstyles could secretly hold a week's worth of croutons, began to speak of salt with the same reverence monks once reserved for relics. Too little, and the stew is flat. Too much, and you've committed a culinary treason. Precision became the quiet revolution. A pinch of salt? No, sir. The correct term, in these hallowed pantries, was une pincée, best said with a dramatic wrist flick. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the British were engaged in their own salty escapades. In the foggy corners of the English countryside, where the only thing louder than the rain was the sound of someone writing poetry about the rain, new salt works arose. Cheshire salt made its mark. Utterly reliable, much like its namesake dogs, and only slightly more edible. And then there was the matter of taxation, because nothing keeps things exciting like government involvement. The Enlightenment didn't quite extend to tax policy, it seems, because salt taxes remained persistently absurd. In France, the gabelle still twisted itself into the lives of citizens like a poorly written subplot. The gabelle, that dreaded salt tax, had mutated by this time into a sprawling bureaucratic beast that determined not only how much salt you bought, but also how, when, and with which eye you were allowed to look at it. Smuggling salt became a national pastime. Salt runners, clever, desperate, and occasionally fond of disguises involving goats, dodged tax collectors like shadowy spice agents. They trekked across borders with sacks strapped to their backs and excuses strapped to their tongues. There's something deeply cozy about imagining these nighttime smugglers, wrapped in wool and resolve, tramping quietly under moonlit trees with contraband seasonings hidden in their shoes. Not heroes exactly, unless you count well-seasoned turnips as heroism, but resourceful and admirably salty. In some places, people were even required to buy salt, taxed or not. Refusing to purchase your allotted amount could get you fined or worse. Imagine explaining to your spouse that you were imprisoned not for gambling or gallivanting, but simply for not being salty enough. It gives new meaning to being a bit bland. And in India, under British colonial rule, salt would soon tiptoe into more rebellious territory. The British imposed a salt tax that struck a raw nerve in a country where salt wasn't just flavor, it was necessity. The tax was regressive and cruel, bearing down heaviest on the poor. Here too, smuggling and silent resistance flourished like wild fennel. But the most poetic upheaval was quietly brewing, pun intended, in the soul of one remarkable man, Mohandas Gandhi. A few years down the road, he'd walk to the sea to gather salt, sparking a revolution with the humble dignity of someone who has decided that enough is enough and doesn't need a sword to prove it. Still, those waves hadn't yet kissed his sandals. Not just yet. For now, salt remained in this curious limbo, simultaneously domestic and political, patron of soup and spoiler of empires, And as cities blossomed and thinkers pondered whether humans were fundamentally good or just creatively mischievous, salt was content to remain in the background, in kitchens, in ledgers, in whispered secrets along smuggler trails. A dash here, a tax there, and a steady little reminder that sometimes the smallest things cause the strongest stirrings. Let's drift a little further now, past Enlightenment salons, and into the next curve of history, where salt's quiet influence seeps into imperial ambitions and the oddly satisfying world of pickling. By the time salt sprinkled its way across Renaissance Europe, it wasn't just a mineral anymore. It was art, alchemy, theology, politics, and dinner, all crammed into coarse crystals that sparkled under candlelight. Salt's presence had become as essential to banquets as a lutenist who couldn't quite tune his instrument but provided decent ambience with his hat. In the courts of Florence, salt began gracing the tables not just for flavor, but as an emblem, a crystalline status symbol nestled in ornate salt cellars that resembled tiny palaces. These ostentatious salières were masterpieces of miniaturization, and a guest's social ranking could be determined by how close they sat to the shaker. Or rather, the golden lion-shaped salt cellar guarded by cherubs and probably cursed by several envious artists. Leonardo da Vinci, whose resume included painting, science, engineering, and probably a mean risotto, once scolded dinner guests for spilling their salt, although primarily because it was expensive and someone else had to sweep it up. Superstition or not, toppling the salt cellar might insult both the host and the alchemical balance of the cosmos. Either way, someone was going to get lightly glared at. Meanwhile, in Venice, salt was still serious business. The Venetian Republic, ever the economic ninja cloaked in silk and smugness, enforced a tight monopoly on salt, as if it were a secret family recipe. The state controlled production, distribution, and pricing through a bureaucracy that made today's DMV look minimalist. Salt taxes flowed back into the lagoon city, funding marble facades and the occasional escapade of a doge who spent well beyond his salary. But not everyone sat at golden banquet tables or navigated trade routes in elegant gondolas. Out in the countryside, peasants still harvested their salt by boiling brine in blackened pots, their days punctuated by steam, soot, and aching arms. Salt work was respectable in the sense that it made your hands strong enough to crush walnuts without blinking, but it was hardly glamorous. Still, salt shaped their world too. It preserved meats through long winters when the sun forgot its duties. It kept butter edible beyond the lifespan of local gossip, and it offered a form of wealth that could be stored, bartered, or crumbled over bland stew with a victorious flourish. Crossing the Channel, England was no stranger to the salty arms race. In fact, the English took it personally. Tudor policies taxed salt aggressively, ensuring that what was once a tasty necessity became, in some households, a rebellious luxury. Smugglers emerged, men in dark cloaks hauling forbidden barrels of crystalline contraband across soggy moors and into whispering villages. There, behind shuttered windows lit with oil lamps, daring housewives salted their cabbages with the grin of a revolutionary. Shakespeare referenced salt with poetic ambiguity, of course. One might add a pinch of salt to a tale too exaggerated, or consider it a metaphor for sincerity, the kind of humility baked into tragedies and Tuesday dinners. In an age when food preservation was either salt or rot, salt remained the thumb on civilization's balance scale. Even Sweden got in on the act, partnering with France in the 17th century to prop up salt supplies in exchange for, presumably, diplomatic puzzlement. The Swedish king, Gustavus Adolphus, wasn't especially interested in condiments. He was mostly orchestrating Protestant military campaigns. But he recognized the economic leverage. Salt, after all, could feed an army, or more precisely, keep the herring from turning into disappointment before it reached the front lines. Back in France, Louis XIV strutted palace halls powdered with wigs and absolutism, while the salt tax, la gabelle, quietly flared resentment among his less powdered subjects. Each province faced different rules, and trying to understand the tax system was a bit like playing chess underwater, while blindfolded and being yelled at in Latin. Salt smugglers, the saltistes, became minor folk heroes, tumbling across fields with bundles of defiance strapped to their backs. It was a strange duality. Salt as symbol of royal excess, and salt as the revolutionaries' rally cry. A spoonful might season the king's lamb chops and, a few leagues away, light a spark beneath a neighbour's fury. So as the age of enlightenment slowly stirred, with ink-stained philosophers playing chess in Parisian cafes and discarding sleep in favour of reason and wild opinions, one thing remained quietly true. Beneath it all, salt continued its silent work, warding off decay, elevating soup, marking tax ledgers, and possibly settling debates over whose goat jerky was least fatal. And as the world edged closer to rupture and reform, a new era of salty discontent was brining just beneath the surface, ready to flavour revolution in ways history would never quite untaste. Let's lie back and let that idea linger, gently crisped, as we drift toward the next quiet turn in the story. While Northern Europe was busy brining fish and pickling everything in arm's reach, a quiet revolution was unrolling by the golden edges of the Sahara Desert, where salt did something entirely different. It became dusty gold. Let us now wander, softly and slowly, into the ancient empires of West Africa, a region not often featured in bedtime tales, though it certainly deserves a spot between your dreams and that half-forgotten glass of water on the nightstand. We're heading into the Sahel belt, to the empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, to climates so dry your laundry would be crisp before it even finished hitting the line. In these sun-drenched lands where rivers shimmered through sand and stories travelled faster than camels could gallop, salt was not seasoning. It was currency, and not a metaphorical currency either. Literal chunks of salt were exchanged for goods, services, and sometimes entire livelihoods. In the kingdom of Ghana, not the modern country, but the ancient empire existing well before the year 1200, salt from the north met gold from the south like two childhood friends reuniting across a crowded market. Caravans of camels, roughly 1,000 strong, would bobble their way across the Sahara, each camel carrying hundreds of pounds of crystalline rectangles quarried from places like Tagaza, where men dug salt instead of gold and seasoned their economies instead of their food. A camel caravan through the Sahara was not a quick errand. It wasn't even a decent day trip. These were month-long expeditions, with traders cocooned in wool headscarves as they braved sandstorms, scorpions, and the existential dread of endless beige. But mice eat cheese, moths find flames, and merchants can always sniff out profit. And salt. Salt was pure, preservable, and irreplaceable. People would trade gold nugget for salt block. Yes, in some regions, salt was literally worth its weight in gold. Now please imagine for a moment a great silent caravan making its way over dunes under a dreamlike moon. No headlights, no GPS, just stars and instinct. At night, the air finally cooled, and the camels shuffled forward with their roomy knees creaking like sleepy library doors. And all for mineral cubes, strapped tight in goat leather bundles. The town of Timbuktu. Yes, that Timbuktu. The one people invoke when they misplace their passport or their last nerve, became a bustling centre for this salty commerce. But Timbuktu was more than a market. It was a university town with scribes, thinkers, and libraries, proving once and for all that scholars and spice traders can get along swimmingly. Here, the salt gold trade mingled with knowledge, as heavily robed men debated Arabic philosophy beneath mud brick mosques, and sun-baked salty slabs were stacked like prize hams in the midday shade. The wealth of Mali was so immense that its emperor, Mansa Musa, the man with a name that sounds like a lullaby, once went on pilgrimage to Mecca in the 14th century, and, according to chroniclers who may or may not have been sleep-deprived, gave away so much gold that he gently destabilized the entire Mediterranean economy. They say charity begins at home, but if you're Mansa Musa, apparently it ends somewhere in Cairo, with the gold market confused and panicking. But one cannot talk about salt without mentioning Tagaza, a peculiar village where buildings were perhaps the only real estate in the world constructed entirely of salt blocks. Imagine that. Entire homes tasting faintly like French fries. The people there built with their treasure, lived inside their currency, and had to import nearly everything else, including food and even fresh water. Because when you specialize in salt, the menu gets politely restricted. And so, in a twist fit for a quiet bedtime chuckle, these grand empires of the Sahel thrived not only because of their gold, but because of their salt. Here, in harsh heat and shifting sands, salt wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity dressed as treasure. From fat slabs hauled over deserts to salty bricks sculpted into homes, this was a civilization brined in brilliance, a place where salt not only flavored food, but flavored fate itself. And with that image glimmering in our minds like a star between dunes, we drift gently, still mid-caravan, our camels singing softly under the Saharan sky, toward another land where salt would start taking to the sea. As the 19th century stretched its legs and took a leisurely stroll into the industrial age, salt, our old crystalline friend, was quietly evolving once again. Not with fanfare or fireworks, but with the slow, rhythmic certainty of a glacier carving out a valley, or a British civil servant tracking trade ledgers. In the burgeoning cities of post-industrial Europe, salt was no longer just a flavor enhancer or meat mummy maker. No, now it had entered into a rather elegant, if unglamorous, partnership with public health. You see, for thousands of years, salt had preserved our food. But now, it was helping to preserve something even more ephemeral: sanitation. Let us take a drowsy detour to 19th century England, where factories coughed soot into grey skies and cobbled streets bore the trampling feet of headstrong city folk and the occasional drunken goose. It was in cities like Manchester, Leeds, and London, where a humble but vital concoction emerged from the minds of plucky engineers: salt-based disinfectants. Yes, what once sprinkled cod now sizzled in serious business. Sodium hypochlorite, produced by reacting brine with electricity or chlorine gas, became a cornerstone of early municipal cleaning efforts. It was pungent, powerful, and unmistakably salty. It swirled in the mop buckets of Victorian maids and hissed in the sewers managed by curious men in waistcoats who took sanitation very, very seriously. And thank goodness they did, else we'd all be succumbing to even more mysterious 19th century ailments with notoriously Dickensian nicknames like dropsy, the vapors, or bad humours. Meanwhile, Salt's talents for manipulating moisture weren't escaping the notice of the burgeoning chemical and textile industries. In dye houses, where bolts of fabric floated like colourful ghosts in basins of colour, salt acted as a fixative, coaxing vivid blues and crimsons to cling to cloth with greater loyalty than some 1800s poets clung to meaningful employment. Factories practically inhaled salt. It was used in soap making, glass making, even metallurgy. All those powerful newfangled processes being fine-tuned and marketed in dense pamphlets with unnecessarily elegant fonts, the kind that included 3 adjectives before every noun and apologetic footnotes in Latin. All depended in one way or another on simple sodium chloride. Across the Atlantic, America's ever-expanding appetite for salt was matched only by its appetite for progress and pickles. From the Great Lakes to Louisiana's Avery Island, salt deposits were coaxed from underground domes with steam-powered enthusiasm. This led to what can only be described as a comically large boom in drilling, brining, and occasional accidental geysering. During the American Civil War, salt took on the role of unsung logistics hero. Soldiers who might have gone without boots still had salted pork. Confederate forces guarded salt works with more attention than some of their more remote forts. Union generals, who knew the strategic value of a good stew, made efforts to strike salty supplies wherever they could. Destroying an enemy's salt works was the 1860s version of disrupting their Wi-Fi. Indeed, the Confederacy even suffered actual food shortages due largely to disrupted salt supply lines. Salt was hoarded, stolen, and bartered with the intensity of a medieval relic or a limited edition vinyl record. But the story of salt in the 1800s isn't merely one of war and industry. It also glimmers with subtle elegance in the world of domestic life. Consider the humble salt cellar, a tabletop item found in most homes tucked lovingly beside the bread plate. In some Victorian households, guests judged their hosts not by the quality of the meal, but by whether the salt cellar had been gently wiped of sea mist residue. Oddly, there also arose a trend in Europe, particularly among spiritualists and homeopaths, of assigning salt slightly mystical properties. Some recommended sleeping with a pouch of salt under your pillow to protect against nightmares. Whether or not this worked is unknown, but the crunchy aftermath the next morning likely inspired a great many abrupt awakenings and very salty language. As the chapter of the 19th century drew to a close, salt had firmly entrenched itself in the modern world, not as a mere seasoning, but a cornerstone of cleanliness, chemistry, and cuisine. It no longer held the dramatic flair of ancient trade routes or imperial wars, but instead hummed steadily in factories, kitchens, and laboratories. A quiet, dependable companion on the road to modernity. And as the 20th century nervously clutched its pearls and prepared to descend into war, science, and space exploration all at once, salt, as always, would be right there, whispering in the background, "Don't mind me. I'll be here if your pickles need brining or your wounds need bathing." Let's rest here for a moment longer as the industrial world settles into twilight. There's more to tell. Just up ahead, in the quiet halls of history, some of the most dramatic changes tiptoed in under the cover of seasoning. Salt, humble, crystalline, and often overstepped by pepper in today's culinary duels, once led empires to glory and cities to ruin. And tonight, as the stars peer down like ancient onlookers, we venture into one of salt's most unsuspecting triumphs, its delicious role in sparking domestic revolution. Inside kitchens, not across battlefields, not over treaties, but in clay pots, cast iron cauldrons, and whatever passed for non-stick in the 13th century. Call it the culinary enlightenment, or just the era when salt stopped being hoarded like cursed treasure and began appearing in recipes openly and proudly. You see, for a long, long time, salt belonged either to emperors, tax collectors, or the kind of smug monks who also invented fancy cheese. It was prized, yes, but seldom sprinkled. In most medieval homes, if a dish had flavour, it meant you lived far too close to the manor. Salt was taxed, traded, rationed, and stored like a valuable relic, not flung over shoulders or dashed onto eggs. But then, quietly and without a single trumpet, came the picklers. These were people, mostly savvy homemakers or sneakily brilliant peasants, who realized that salt could do more than add a salty zing. It could preserve. It could extend a carrot's retirement by 6 months, or transform a suspicious fish into something that wouldn't cause poetic hallucinations. Salting was safety. Salting was time travel for food. In buried clay jars and wooden vats, sauerkraut was born. Anchovies huddled in barrels like introverted warriors waiting for pasta to be invented. Kimchi began murmuring from Korea, and salted lemons from Morocco sang softly to the palate. Without realizing it, common kitchens were becoming test labs for civilization. Villages with access to salt could suddenly feed their populations through bitter winters. They didn't have to rely on feudal lords' generosity, a truly unreliable resource. With salted stores, they could plan, trade, and even, scandalously, try spices with names longer than 2 syllables. In Italy, the clandestine genius of cured meats began prowling through the alleys. Prosciutto was hung like laundry, salami started appearing at festivals, and Parmigiano, the king of cheeses who rarely smiled, entered the scene with a salty swagger, maturing over years, as if brooding on a throne made of sheep's milk and ambition. Meanwhile, in France, a new hero emerged, fleur de sel, the delicate kiss-of-the-sea salt, skimmed from the surface of evaporation ponds, carried by breezes and monks with suspiciously soft hands. It wasn't just used for flavouring anymore. It was a symbol. Sprinkle it atop a stew, and you weren't just eating dinner. You were performing a tiny act of refinement, a soft rebellion against the coarse boar meat of generations past. Even the British, whose cuisine often wore a wool sweater of understatement, found inspiration. Salted beef became the sailing staple known as salt horse, a dish beloved by sailors and largely unmentionable in poetry. Still, it was edible weeks after docking, which, in maritime terms, bordered on magic. Salt was now not only valuable, it was versatile. It was performance art in the kitchen, an edible insurance policy, and a household's quiet declaration of control over nature's chaos. All of this led, slowly and melodiously, to the tradition of the salt cellar, not a mine, but the small ornamental bowl on the dinner table. It may sound minor, like nightly napkin rings, but the mere presence of a salt cellar meant you were no longer afraid of running out. You'd made it. You had enough to set aside for flavor alone. This wasn't just wealth. This was comfort, stability, salty self-determination. And thus, salt trickled from sovereignty to domesticity, from taxation to taste, from empire-wide monopolies to the tiniest pinch between fingers, right before soup. As households gained control over preservation, flavor, and even culinary flair, the balance of power shifted ever so gently toward the table, where kings and commoners alike needed seasoning. And as we settle in for the night, imagining ancient hands folding cabbage into brine or packing fish into tidy crystalline tombs, we begin to see just how quiet rebellions are stirred, not with swords, but with spoons. Now, as the firelight grows low and your mind gently slides toward dreams of softly sizzling pans and fog-draped spice roots, the story of salt is not quite over. There's still one grain left, just waiting to dissolve. The sun, somewhere in the sleepy cracks of time, is softening into golden vapors. Our journey with salt, warrior, merchant, healer, preserver, tax and tantrum causer, has taken us across deserts, through ancient cities, into kitchens and crusades. And now, as the grains fall through the hourglass, we arrive at a quieter place, a place where salt simply is the present, or rather, the wistful, meandering present of just before sleep. In today's world, salt sits rather demurely in ceramic dishes and plastic shakers, passed politely across dinner tables. There are no riots over it, usually, and kings no longer send armies to keep it under lock and crust. Yet for something that once moved empires, it now chills contentedly between the pepper and the olive oil, watching episodes of culinary shows with mild approval. But don't be fooled by its table manners. Salt hasn't retired, it's merely evolved. It has become the quiet star of slow-cooked stews, of tenderly brined Thanksgiving turkeys, and overly ambitious sourdough projects. It still preserves, it still cures, and it still whispers secrets into the shells of oysters and the crusts of bread. Its influence, though less dramatic, remains rooted beneath our fingertips and taste buds. Consider this. Every cell in your body, from the twitchy ones in your eyelids to the dreamy ones in your pinky toes, relies on salt to send its little electric messages. These messages are like polite telegrams saying, "Please move left arm," or "Now would be a good time to laugh at that joke." Without salt, we don't spark, we fizzle. And then there's the sea. Oh, the sea. A place where salt both began and never left. The ocean is, in essence, a worldwide brine. Not quite soup, not quite salad dressing, but something in between. Billions of years ago, when Earth was still a sizzling pancake of lava and amino acids just starting their tiny party, salt was already swirling in the waters. It marinated pre-life before recipes were even a thing. Even now, sea salt finds its way into our cupboards, wearing boutique labels: Fleur de Sel, Sel Gris, Jacobson, Malden. Each as salty as the next, but dressed for a dinner party. We sprinkle them lovingly over avocado toast and caramel ice cream, like the luxurious descendants of ancient Roman laborers. Salt also has a modern resume worth bragging about. It helps keep roads safe during winter tantrums. It lives in IV drips at hospitals, aiding healing while nurses wear sneakers and talk in comforting tones. It's used in the industrial production of plastics, soaps, and even paper. So yes, the paper this bedtime history script was first written on. Probably salted, and through it all, salt has never made a fuss. Compared to gold, it's less flashy. Compared to oil, it's less slippery. Compared to sugar, it doesn't even try to be liked. But the world hums a little more smoothly because it's there. Which brings us to a final, quiet thought. Salt has always been about balance. A little too much, and things fall apart. A stew becomes a salt lick, an economy staggers. Too little, and we wither. But just enough, and life tastes like itself. Balanced, breathable, beautifully seasoned. So as your head drifts back against the pillow, imagine the gentle clink of a spoon stirring a pot, the soft crunch of a bread crust meeting lips. Somewhere out there, a sea breeze leaves behind a lace of salt on a forgotten rock. And even now, deep in the quiet places of your own body, sodium and chloride ions are carrying out their timeless dance, ancient invisible, ever kind. Sleep well, salt historian. The grains can wait till morning.